I had always found solace in the quiet moments spent alone on my fishing boat, especially at night. The stillness of the lake, the gentle lapping of water against the hull, and the stars reflecting on the surface created a tranquil escape from the noise of everyday life. On this particular night, the urge to fish struck me suddenly, and despite the late hour, I decided to venture out alone. The old wooden boat, worn and weathered by years of use, creaked as I pushed it into the water. The air was cool, and a light mist hung over the lake, shrouding everything in an eerie fog. I rowed out to my favorite spot, a secluded area far from the shore where the fish were usually plentiful. The only sounds were the rhythmic splashing of the oars and the distant hoot of an owl. Once I reached the spot, I dropped anchor and cast my line. The water was unusually calm, and the mist seemed to thicken around me, reducing my visibility to just a few feet. The lantern at the bow of the boat cast a small circle of light, barely penetrating the dense fog. I settled in, the familiar anticipation of a catch setting in. Hours passed, but there were no bites. The mist grew denser, and the silence became almost oppressive. I began to feel an unease that I couldn't quite explain, as if something was watching me from the shadows just beyond the lantern's reach. I shook off the feeling and checked my line, only to find the bait untouched. I decided to move to another spot. As I pulled up the anchor, I noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic splashing sound, like someone or something was moving through the water nearby. I stopped rowing and listened, but the sound ceased as suddenly as it had begun. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just a fish or a distant animal. I rowed to a new location and cast my line again. The mist continued to thicken, the lantern's light barely cutting through the gloom. The splashing sound returned, closer this time. I swung the lantern around, trying to pierce the fog, but saw nothing. Anxiety gnawed at me, but I refused to give in to fear. After all, I had been on this lake countless times and had never encountered anything to be afraid of. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the water itself, a soft, melodic voice that sent chills down my spine. I scanned the mist, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating the same unintelligible phrase over and over, beckoning me. I gripped the sides of the boat, trying to steady my nerves. The whispers continued, now accompanied by the splashing sound, circling the boat. The water rippled, and I saw a shadow moving just beneath the surface. I grabbed the oars, ready to leave, but the boat refused to move, as if held in place by an unseen force. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadow beneath the water grew darker, rising towards the surface. I leaned over the edge, trying to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. A pale, ghostly face staring up at me with hollow, dark eyes. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, filling my mind with a terror I had never known. I stumbled back, nearly tipping the boat. The face disappeared, and the water became still once more, but the whispers continued, echoing in my mind. I desperately tried to row away, but the boat remained stationary, anchored by the weight of my fear. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt cold, clammy hands grasping at my ankles, pulling me towards the edge of the boat. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was unyielding. With a final, desperate effort, I broke free and grabbed the anchor, hauling it up as quickly as I could. The boat lurched forward, and I rowed frantically, the whispers fading into the distance. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breaths came in ragged gasps as I finally reached the shore. I stumbled out of the boat, collapsing onto the wet sand. The mist had lifted, and the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I looked back at the lake, now calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. Something was out there, something that had tried to drag me into the depths. I never returned to the lake after that night. The memory of those whispers and the ghostly face haunted my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lurked in the water was still watching, waiting for another chance to claim its prey. Years later, I heard rumors of others who had encountered the same eerie phenomena on the lake. Fishermen who had gone missing, their boats found adrift and empty, whispers heard in the dead of night. The lake, once a place of peace and solitude, had become a place of dread, its dark waters hiding secrets best left undisturbed. And so, the lake remains, a silent sentinel to the horrors that lie beneath, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to venture out alone into the night, never to return. I hadn't seen my old friends from college in years. Life had taken us in different directions, but when Jake suggested a fishing trip to rekindle our friendship, I jumped at the chance. We planned to meet at a remote lake we used to visit during our younger days. The idea of spending a weekend surrounded by nature and old friends was too good to pass up. We arrived at the lake on a sunny Friday afternoon. The water shimmered in the light, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Jake, Mike, Tom, and I unloaded our gear, laughing and reminiscing about the old times. We set up camp on the shore and quickly got to work preparing the boat for our first fishing trip in years. Tom was the last to arrive. He had always been the quietest among us, but this time he seemed even more withdrawn. He barely said a word as he set up his tent and prepared his gear. We tried to include him in our conversations, but he responded with only monosyllables and vacant stares. "Tom, you okay?" I asked, trying to catch his eye. He looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "Yeah, just tired," he said, turning away to busy himself with his fishing rod. I exchanged a concerned glance with Jake and Mike, but we decided to let it go. Maybe he was just having a rough week. The first day on the lake was perfect. The fish were biting, and we spent the afternoon joking and catching up. Tom, however, remained distant, barely participating. He spent most of the time staring out over the water, his expression unreadable. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the conversation turned to old stories and shared memories. Tom sat apart from us, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on something we couldn't see. As the fire died down and we prepared to turn in for the night, Tom stood up abruptly. "I'm going for a walk," he said, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could respond. Jake, Mike, and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Something's definitely up with him," Mike said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we should talk to him tomorrow," Jake suggested. "Give him some time to come around." We agreed and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Tom was back at camp, sitting by the water's edge. He looked pale and exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. He didn't say a word as we prepared breakfast and got ready for another day of fishing. We headed out onto the lake, the mood considerably more subdued than the day before. Tom sat at the back of the boat, staring into the water. As the hours passed, his behavior grew increasingly strange. He would mutter to himself, his eyes darting around as if he were seeing things we couldn't. At one point, he dropped his rod and stood up suddenly, almost tipping the boat over. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Something's not right here." "Tom, what's going on?" Jake asked, trying to steady him. I can't explain it," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. "But we need to go, now." Before we could respond, he jumped into the water and started swimming towards the shore. We watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Finally, we decided to follow him back to camp and try to get some answers. When we reached the shore, Tom was nowhere to be found. We searched the campsite and the surrounding woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. As the sun began to set, a sense of dread settled over us. "We need to find him," Jake said, his voice filled with urgency. "He could be hurt." We grabbed our flashlights and set out into the woods, calling Tom's name as we went. The darkness closed in around us, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. After what felt like hours, we came upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The door was ajar and a faint light flickered inside. We approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Tom?" I called out, my voice barely audible. There was no response. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. In the corner, huddled on the floor, was Tom. His clothes were soaked and he was shivering uncontrollably. "Tom, what the hell are you doing here?" Mike asked, rushing to his side. Tom looked up at us, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he whispered. "It followed me." "What's here?" Jake asked, but Tom didn't answer. He just kept repeating the same words over and over. Suddenly, the temperature in the cabin dropped and a cold wind swept through the room. The lantern flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a presence, something cold and oppressive, pressing in around us. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We grabbed Tom and helped him to his feet, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The room grew colder, and I could hear a faint whispering, like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Panic set in as we struggled to open the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with a sense of dread. Finally, the door gave way, and we stumbled out into the night. We ran back to camp, not stopping until we reached the safety of our tents. Tom collapsed by the fire, his breathing ragged. "We need to leave," he said again, his voice filled with desperation. We didn't argue. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could and headed for the cars. The drive back to town was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Whatever had happened out there, it was something we would never forget. When we finally reached town, we took Tom to the hospital. The doctors said he was suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. He didn't speak for days, his eyes filled with a haunted look. It wasn't until weeks later that he finally told us what had happened. He said that something had followed us to the lake, something that had been waiting for him. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that it was still out there, watching and waiting. We never spoke of the trip again. The lake, once a place of fond memories, had become a place of nightmares. And though we tried to move on with our lives, the darkness that had followed us from the woods remained, a constant reminder of the horrors we had faced. In the end, we all went our separate ways, unable to shake the feeling that we had escaped something far worse than we could ever imagine. And I knew that no matter how far we ran, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The idea of a weekend fishing trip with my buddies seemed perfect. A chance to unwind, share some laughs, and maybe catch some decent fish. We had all been feeling the weight of our respective lives, and the lake, surrounded by thick forest and far from civilization, promised the kind of peace we were yearning for. The group consisted of 4, me, Jake, Mike, and Dave. We had been friends since high school, and though life had taken us on different paths, we still tried to get together whenever we could. This trip was our chance to reconnect, to relive some of the carefree days of our youth. We set out early Saturday morning, the weather crisp and clear. The drive to the lake was filled with easy banter and laughter, and by the time we reached the water, we were in high spirits. We loaded our gear into the boat and set off, the engine purring softly as we glided across the glassy surface. The day passed in a blur of fishing, joking, and reminiscing. The fish were biting, the sun was shining, and it felt like nothing could go wrong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we decided to call it a day and head back to shore. As we neared the dock, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but as we drew closer, I saw her clearly. A woman stood at the edge of the water, her long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing a white dress that billowed in the evening breeze. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing towards the shore. Jake, who was steering the boat, squinted. "Yeah, I see her. Weird, we didn't see anyone else here all day." Mike and Dave turned to look, their expressions mirroring my confusion. As we approached, the woman's presence grew more unsettling. She stood perfectly still, her face obscured by her hair, making it impossible to see her features. We docked the boat, and as we stepped onto the shore, the woman remained unmoving. An uneasy silence fell over us as we gathered our gear. I felt a strange compulsion to approach her, though a part of me screamed to stay away. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Jake called out, his voice uncertain. The woman didn't respond. She simply stood there, like a statue carved from the twilight. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Maybe she needs help," Dave suggested, but his voice wavered. I took a few cautious steps forward, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. "Ma'am," I called out again, but there was no reaction. As I got closer, I could see that her dress was old, the fabric tattered and stained. The sense of wrongness intensified, and I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something about her compelled me to move closer. Finally, I was just a few feet away from her. I reached out, my hand trembling. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She lifted her head slowly, and my flashlight revealed her face. My heart froze. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring back at me, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. A cold, lifeless smile spread across her lips. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Guys, we need to go. Now." Jake, Mike, and Dave saw the look on my face and didn't ask questions. We hurried back to the boat, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. The woman remained at the shore, her empty gaze following us, that eerie smile never wavering. As we pushed off from the dock, the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in as Jake frantically tried to restart it. The woman began to move, gliding towards the water, her dress trailing behind her like mist. Come on," Mike yelled, his eyes wide with fear. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from the shore, but not before I caught a final glimpse of the woman stepping into the water. She seemed to dissolve into the lake, her form merging with the dark surface. We didn't speak as we navigated back to the main dock, our minds reeling from what we had just witnessed. The once peaceful lake now felt oppressive, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. We docked the boat and quickly loaded our gear into the car, eager to put as much distance between us and the lake as possible. The drive back was a blur. The laughter and camaraderie of the morning had been replaced by a heavy silence. We each retreated into our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was only later, after we had parted ways and returned to our lives, that I began to have the nightmares. I would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, the image of the woman's hollow eyes burned into my mind. I could still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, calling me back to the lake. One night, I woke to find myself standing at the edge of my bed, staring out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the room, and I felt an overwhelming urge to return to the lake. I fought it, but the compulsion grew stronger with each passing day. Unable to resist any longer, I found myself driving back to the lake one night. The roads were empty, the journey shrouded in an eerie stillness. When I arrived, the fog was thick, the water dark and foreboding. I stepped out of the car and walked to the shore, my heart pounding in my chest. She was there, waiting for me. Her long black hair framed her hollow eyes, and that lifeless smile greeted me once more. I felt a cold hand wrap around my heart, pulling me towards her. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. As I stepped into the water, the whispers grew louder, drowning out all other thoughts. The cold enveloped me, and I felt myself sinking, the lake closing in around me. Her eyes were the last thing I saw before darkness consumed me. My friends would later search for me, but they would find nothing. No trace of my car, no sign that I had ever been there. The lake would keep its secrets, just as it always had, and the woman in white would continue to wait, her hollow eyes watching for the next soul to claim.